everybody, and welcome to today's episode of the Student Outcomes Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah, co-founder and research director at Cosmos. And in this really special three-way discussion, we'll be diving into an incredibly important and timely topic, trauma-informed practice in education. We're really excited to have two amazing guests with us today. So we have Helen Lord and Gemma Kay, who'll both be bringing a real wealth of experience and knowledge to this conversation. So Helen and Gemma, welcome to the Student Outcomes Podcast. I'll do a really quick intro and then we'll get into it. I'll set the scene. So Helen is head of Greater Manchester Higher UniConnect Partnership and is also co-founder of a new network. We just had the first kickoff meeting this morning.
We did.
Yeah. And that is the Widening Participation Professional Network Community of Practice. Is that right?
Yeah. It is. That's exactly right.
Lovely. And then we've got Gemma, who is Director of Aspire to HE, and that's a UniConnect partnership at the University of Wolverhampton. And you are also Governor at St Bishop's College.
St Joseph.
Oh, St Joseph's. Right, yeah, sorry. St Joseph's College. I did know that one. And both of you guys will be supporting me in this conversation today. We'll have a chat, we'll have a discussion about this topic and how it came to be, really. And you've both obviously got experience of supporting students from disadvantaged backgrounds through their educational journey in particular. So we will dig into that as well. So I just want to kind of set the scene really in terms of how this conversation came about, this three-way conversation. So we obviously all were at the parliamentary reception meeting in London, which was the Neon meeting. And then after that, we all kind of caught up and had a bit of a bonding session over our own experiences, personal experiences with personal trauma, how that's affected and impacted our lives, really. And then we kind of came on to the discussion of education and how important it is. And then, we kind of came into, actually, let's have a chat about this on the podcast. And I think particularly because in our space, it sometimes feels like it's not a topic that's explored or really kind of elevated or highlighted, essentially, as much as we feel it should, because we feel it's it's an important topic, essentially. So I have been doing some research, so I'll just go through some research on this topic, and then we can, like I say, we can have a deeper chat about this stuff. So poverty and trauma generally. So what I found, kind of just generally looking this up, looking at peer-reviewed articles, some of the grey literature around this, is that children from disadvantaged backgrounds are at a higher risk of experiencing trauma. I know, Helen, you mentioned some of this in your presentation earlier on this morning, and that was really interesting. So you talked about the fact that 60% of school-based learners in state schools have some trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had some trauma-informed training recently, and the facilitator who came in used that statistic. It was a statistic that she'd pulled from before the pandemic, and so it's expected to actually be higher than that now. But I think it just gives a really good indication of the number of young people in education who have experienced some form of trauma and will be dealing with that. And that can, of course, impact their experience of education and how they engage with education.
Yeah, definitely. And also in relation to that, just in terms of the poverty aspect, some of the research that I've been looking into as well shows that students from disadvantaged backgrounds have a 10 times greater chance of being placed on a child protection plan compared to those from wealthier areas, essentially. And then when it comes to emotional and behavioural impact, I think that's a really interesting topic to look into, because essentially the trauma changes the behaviour of students and how they obviously show up in a school setting and in the classroom. We were obviously just having a little bit of a chat before this just about the fact that it's a bit of an iceberg. You might only see that tip, and there's just a lot underneath that these students are generally having to deal with and wrestle with, essentially. So it affects, emotional well-being, leading to those mental health issues like depression and anxiety. So 4.6 times more likely to experience depression, unfortunately, those students who have gone through some traumatic experiences. And then just generally in terms of cognitive and learning challenges as well. So trauma can impair attention, memory, problem solving, all these characteristics that are just obviously crucial when it comes to academic performance and having the best academic performance that a student can have, essentially. And then you've got the snowball of that obviously leading to attainment, and then, you know, kind of getting behind and not being able to catch up. So I feel like that's that's a bit of a dive into that area, just in terms of some of the things that I've seen. And so it's why it's so important. It touches, in terms of the statistics of the students that we generally work with, I imagine that this will affect the vast majority of them. So looking at trauma-informed practice in education, generally, you know, implementing trauma-informed practices in schools, I think we're generally of that understanding, and I think we all feel that that will really help to create a really supportive, safe environment for students. You know, we want them to thrive, really, and want to be able to support them in the best way we can. So I think that's enough from me. We'll get into it now, and I'd just love to kind of start off with you sharing a bit of your own personal journey and experiences in terms of how you generally came to this topic. So yeah, Helen.
Okay. So I don't know where to start with it, really. I suppose we started with the conversation about trauma, and I think it's something that, because it's become part of the discourse, I think, at the moment, in terms of education and in terms of access and outreach, which is, you know, the area that I work in, I think it's probably kind of prompted me to think about my own experience and to reflect on my own experience a little bit more. I lost my mum suddenly when I was in high school. I was 13, and so I went to school in the morning, everything was normal, and then I came home from school at the end of the day, and that was it. She was gone, and my life was totally turned upside down. And obviously that happens at a time when you're a teenager and you've got hormones, and you're changing, and you're becoming a young adult as well. And you know, I don't think it's an understatement to say that your life is never the same again after that happens. And I'm the oldest of 4 children as well. And I think back in those days, children didn't get any therapy. So there was no counselling, there was no support for us to navigate that grief and to be able to talk about her together as a family and to remember her in that way. So it feels like something that gets shut away and not spoken about, and therefore not resolved. And then it therefore ends up being something that you just sort of carry with you. And it's this deep sadness and this deep trauma that you carry. And I think for me, that made me feel really vulnerable. It made me feel very emotionally vulnerable, because I didn't feel strong, because I was always sort of dealing with that. So I feel in some ways, I think it probably did impact my journey through education from there, not having that person who's your sort of lighthouse in a way and shows the way. My dad was amazing, and he gave me some good advice, but I didn't listen to him. Whereas I feel like I would have listened to my mum. So I therefore had a non-traditional journey into higher education. I eventually got into university and graduated, and but I just think that, I don't know, I just feel that if there'd been more support to resolve that, I feel like I would have felt better equipped to navigate higher education, but also all of those decisions that are needed when you're making the choice about where to go and study and about what to study. And I think the place that I'm in now is that when I look back, and I look back on that younger person who felt emotionally vulnerable and who felt like they weren't strong, I want to sort of say to them now how strong you are. You are really resilient. And actually, as a result of that, you've got these superpowers. And this was what we discussed, wasn't it? That we were like, God, yeah, it really does give you superpowers. Like, I've always been compassionate and I've always been empathetic. But that experience, I feel like, has just times that by 10. And I think that is that's really impacted sort of the work that I do, and it informs how I am and how passionate I am about the work that I do. And I find that with a lot of people that work in the area of access and outreach, is that we have this massive capacity for compassion, and being really passionate about social justice as well. I think when you've overcome challenges and barriers yourself, and you know how difficult it is to do that, you recognise it in others, and then end up in this situation where you want to be able to give something back and to help others to overcome their own barriers. And I see that a lot, I think, in the people around me that I work with. Lots of people tend to come from an English or literature background, what they've studied, or even drama as well. And I always say there's something about that I say about To Kill a Mockingbird, and the quote is something around, you know, to understand somebody else and where they come from, you need to climb in their skin and walk around in it. And I always think that that's when you study literature, when you study drama in English, that's what it allows you to do. And it therefore enhances, I think, that compassion. So I feel like that's another sort of reason and background that's maybe not linked to trauma, but I think if we're talking about the access and the outreach space, you do tend to get a lot of people in there with that. But of course, I think when you're reading and you're reading world stories and other people's stories and understanding other cultures as well, you're understanding the trauma that other people have gone through as well. So I do think there's a link.
I love that link between trauma, English literature, you know, that side of reading and kind of really understanding those stories, different people's perspectives, and getting immersed in it as well, to be honest. So I absolutely loved it. Was funny when you saying that, because I was a bookworm when I was younger. I don't have as much time to read now as I would like, but I just would completely immerse myself in stories. And yeah, you kind of like understanding other people's experiences and what they do, and it's outside of your realm and your world. And I love the idea of that and that compassionate element. But I definitely agree with you in terms of the people in our space. There's always I suppose, a reason and a drive behind why people in our space care so much and do this work. And it usually kind of comes from their own personal experiences. And so thank you, Helen. I'll come to Gemma next.
Yeah, I was just thinking as well, reflecting there, that we read them more because we didn't have mobile phones and social media the way kids do today. And we had to read for entertainment, really, didn't we? But similar to Helen, really, my experience, I was 11 and I lost my brother to suicide. And then 2 months later, lost my mum to suicide. So that was obviously extremely traumatic and very, you know, we've talked about this, rapid, suddenly one day you go to school and it looks like this, and you come home and life's very different. I ended up, because of that, my mum and dad had separated just before that happened. So my dad had moved away. So I then had started high school and then had to move to another city and go to another high school. I actually ended up going to 6 different high schools in total by the time I'd completed my GCSEs. And big part of the reason for that was my dad didn't cope well with losing his wife and his son, and turned to drinking. So I really was being a carer for him and his alcohol problem. And for some of that time, I went to boarding school and boarded during the week, which is kind of massively against my social mobility principles, I must say. But that was kind of really my sort of my mum's brother and sister that recognised that I wasn't being as well looked after at home as I probably should have been. And some of that was to try and take me out of that situation. So I did that for a couple of years. And obviously that was very difficult because that was sort of then being taken away to a completely new environment, which is difficult enough to be away from home at that age. But it definitely impacted my educational journey. I wasn't even thinking about higher education. I think before my mum died, growing up, I always wanted to be a paediatrician. That was what I wanted to do. And that idea of going to university was just disappeared, really. And it was more about surviving day to day. And I very much wanted to fit in. So I think, a bit like Helen said, there wasn't really anything around counselling. There wasn't that support. I don't think they knew what to do with me. it was almost so traumatic that how do we help this child, really? And I just wanted to fit in everywhere I went. So I remember comparing death to saying to somebody, well, has your hamster ever died? Or have you lost a pet? It's just death. It's all the same, which obviously now looking back is a crazy statement. But I just didn't want to be known as the girl that, lost a mum and a brother. I just wanted to fit in. So in the end, my dad was quite poorly, really, through the alcoholism by the time I'd sat my GCSEs. And I remember coming home from collecting my results, and I'd not done very well. I'd done okay. I'd got some B's and C's. And
That's all I got.
I think that's really good.
I think I was expected to have done better. But yeah, I came home, and in those days, Clearing was the Guardian newspaper. My dad had got himself out and about and gone to the shop and got the paper. And he actually did say to me, I think you should consider going to university. And I was like, well, how can I go? I'm looking after you. And he was like, no, you must go. So I rang everywhere and I couldn't get in. I thought I think what you were saying about English and drama, because I was looking after my dad, I thought, oh, I'll be a nurse. I'm not got the grades to be a doctor. I'll be a nurse. I couldn't get in anywhere. And then there was a new course in Lincoln, which was health studies. And it was a new university at that time. I was one of the first cohorts, if not, I think possibly the first cohort. And I went there, and I amazingly, looking back now, I lived in Sheffield. Not that you can really tell by my accent anymore. This is, I think, a mechanism of fitting in. It changes everywhere I go. But I used to get up at 5 a.m. I would get a bus to the train station, and then I'd get a train to Lincoln, and I'd sit in a little cafe and have beans on toast and wait for my lectures to start at 10. And I'd go and do my lectures, and then I'd come home, and then I'd do the food shopping and clean the house and try and help my dad. And then in about the January, it was about 3 months into uni, one of the lecturers, John, came up to me and just said, is everything okay? Because we don't really see you much around the university other than, your lectures. And I explained what was happening. And he said, we've got a house got some girls in the second year. They've got a house, they've got a space. Why don't you move? So I took the decision to move to uni. And a month after that, my dad fell down the stairs and broke his neck from drinking. And then I was there, and there was a pivotal moment for me where the university were actually really supportive of me. And they said, look, you can get through this first year. You've just got one more assignment to hand in, and then you can have the summer and take some time, and then hopefully come back in September again afresh for your second year and still complete your degree in 3 years. And that's what I did. I kind of just put my head down, as I always had, really, and cracked on. And I really felt like that university was my home. So when I finished my undergrad degree, I kind of had nowhere to go. So I ended up doing a postgrad at another uni, and did my teaching qualification then at Keele. And actually, I think interestingly what Helen said about my career then has actually been about helping people. So teaching, I did that, I think, because I had family members that were teachers, and also felt that I wanted children that had had bad experiences like me in school to feel supported, and that I could try and give something back. That if all this bad stuff had happened, how could I make it worthwhile and mean something? I felt like I had a responsibility to my mum, my dad and my brother of being the only one left. How do I give something back? So that kind of where my idea for teaching came from. And then the Connections service nationally was set up. So I was one of the youngest and first Connections personal advisors. I went into that and then got into careers and so on. And like Helen said, now the working in access and outreach in higher education, there's so many people that we come across in this sector that are just so passionate about tackling disadvantage and tackling, the reasons why still there's this underrepresentation of certain groups in higher education. And we come across really kindred spirits, really, which is why we're all sat here today, I guess, and how we'd kind of had these conversations. And I think for me, it's about continuing to try and give something back and having that purpose.
Thank you for sharing, guys. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And it's obviously very kind of sensitive topic because we're talking about trauma, really. You know, it's deep issue, isn't it? And yeah, I just really appreciate you coming on and sharing that and your context and your story and obviously how this all came to be. And I suppose from my perspective, I didn't necessarily have that sharp kind of life-changing trauma where, you know, one day your world's fine and then you come home and everything's changed. But for me, it was more the fact that I had a parent that was alive at the time, but, you know, didn't really have much of a relationship with me. So my mum was a single mother, raised me as a single mum, and there was quite a lot of hardship that came with that. I think, like I was saying to Helen just before, I was a bookworm, and I always kind of turned to my books in those times, really. And I think for me, generally, I'd always had this kind of deep sense of not feeling good enough, and I think that's something that's generally stayed with me a little bit. I think some of these things don't necessarily leave you, do they? But I think it is that feeling of just not feeling like you're good enough, because obviously there's this other parent who's there and they don't really want to see you, essentially. There was generally some kind of contextual things that happened around that. I do talk to my dad now. We do have a relationship, but I think for my formative years, the fact that I didn't have a dad, it was very difficult for me to look at other my friends, and their family, and see them together with their parents, and really kind of thinking, well, why don't I have that? What's wrong with me? And I think sometimes when you go through these experiences as a child, I have been reading about some of this stuff as well, is that children generally tend to internalize this, even though it's an external environmental factor. You tend to internalize it and think it's something that you've done wrong. So I think for a very long time, it was always something that I thought I'd done something wrong in that situation, in terms of, not having that relationship with that parent. So yeah, I think it affects us all, doesn't it? There's these things. And
yeah, I think that's really resonating with me, because it's sort of making me think back to sort of how I felt then and how it impacted me over the years. And it's that sense of lacking something, isn't it? That
absolutely.
You feel like you lack something.
Yeah.
And that's part of that emotional vulnerability that I talked about. And then that affects your confidence as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And so if I go back to that educational journey and think, well, I got B's and C's at GCSE, and I've always said, oh, well, that's all right, isn't it? But I was in the top sets and probably should have got better than that. And then dropped out of the education system in college and went back when I did something at night school, but that meant I couldn't get into a top university. And Manchester Met even turned me down. Where I did go, I really enjoyed, and I went for a couple of years, and then went on, moved back home and ended up graduating from UCLan in the end. And then the career just went like sort of all over the place. And I think just feeling a bit unmoored, I think it's you have that sense, don't you? And then it doesn't just affect your education. I think I was always really conscious of the fact that, the university or the institute that I went to, other people sort of maybe look down on that a little bit. So then that makes you feel like not as good, and that can impact your confidence. And that when you get into the workplace, I think I carried that through with me into the workplace as well, and was always like never feeling very confident in the workplace either, even though people around me were saying, oh, you're really good, and will you do this and will you do that? So yeah, when I think when you talk about that idea of, feeling that something's lacking, I just think that really resonated with me, and it was just making me go back to that educational journey and how that trauma actually impacts you. And I think even if you're just dropping a few grades at GCSE, even that can impact you, because I think it's then about it's how you internalize it, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I think I probably internalized it as I'm a very average student, whereas actually I've got much higher than average skills when it comes to emotional intelligence, which have, which has a lot of currency these days. And I know that now, but I didn't back then. So I've sort of gone off on a bit of a waffly reflection there.
But I think that's how we got onto the chat about superpowers, wasn't it? I think
Yeah.
I feel like I understand that more now than I obviously did when I was younger and at the time. And like I said, I just tried to fit in, rather than feel I could talk about my experience at the time. I didn't really tell anybody about it, or I didn't, not that I was, it's not like I'm ashamed of it or anything, but just like, actually, I don't want people to feel that this is a weakness in me. And it probably felt like it was. And I think for all the reasons that you say, because actually I think the thing that resonated that you said, Sarah, as well, was about formative years. I think with children, we were in our, 11, 12, 13, being that age. I've got an almost 11 and an almost 14-year-old. I've got boys now. And you see, how much they're developing. You see the hormones kicking in. And actually, it significantly impacted who I am as a person, how I feel about myself, my confidence, my worth, massively. And in particular as well, I think for me, suicide is particularly brutal because it's a choice. So obviously my brother had mental health issues. He had schizophrenia, and I almost felt relieved for him when he did what he did, that he was free of that pain. And whereas my mum, it felt like huge abandonment that she chose a dead child over a live one. And that's been something that's always going to be there. That's kind of, that's talk about Pandora's box, don't we? And
Yeah.
I think you talked, Helen, about carrying that deep sadness, and I think that does change you, but it does give you the bonus of that is, like you say, that superpower of really being able to understand other people's pain and emotions and be compassionate. And I think it also gives you a sense of that. I think I think I'm quite I can sense people's feelings.
Yeah.
I think you could tell when somebody's not feeling good or having a difficult time. And I think as I've grown into more sort of management and leadership roles in my career, I think that's an incredible superpower to be able to support people, because I think that's what makes amazing leaders and amazing bosses, is that you work with people and you can really help and support them.
Yeah, I think it makes you really perceptive, doesn't it?
Yeah, I was just about to say that, almost like that hypersensitivity.
Yeah.
I think because I don't know how it kind of manifests in a way. It's interesting that we've all had quite different, obviously the situations are different, but in terms of how that's manifested, it's manifested in similar ways, just in terms of self-worth and efficacy and lacking what we feel we lack. And just that last point, really. I think you do kind of, it makes you kind of almost tune more into other people in a way, because I think, because I had that doubt about my own self and not feeling good enough, I then kind of turned into a real people pleaser. I just wanted people to be happy with me. And that was, if they weren't, or if I didn't feel that they were, that was a big threat to me. And yeah, I just kind of leaned very, very heavily into that. And yeah, I suppose it is that, like you say, that you just become more perceptive, don't you?
Yeah. And I think what we were talking about is it's about that value and how much you value yourself, isn't it? I think that's what it impacts on. And just thinking about this morning with the community of practice that we launched, and I was talking about trauma and the link to mattering and belonging. And I think those who have experienced trauma are less likely to think that their contributions are valued. And I think what we've just been talking about, in a way, goes some way to provide some real life examples of how that manifests and what it looks like.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really interesting point, actually. We've literally just proven that point in terms of the evidence and not feeling like like you say, our contributions are valued. Oh, thanks, guys. So I think actually what I'll do is I'll jump on from that superpower, because I think that's a really interesting topic. Obviously, we don't want to diminish the the trauma and the impact that has, but I suppose out of that, it does leave behind this trail of almost like like you say, a superpower skill. So we've talked about being very emotionally in tune with people and having high emotional intelligence, and you being able to pick up on if something's not quite right, almost that kind of sixth sense in a way, because you're kind of hypersensitive, aren't you? And I feel like the other thing as well is that overcoming challenge and obstacles and resilience and grit, to be honest. I think, deep down inside, there's situations I've been in where I just feel like I can't give in. I have to persevere. And again, I don't know if that's probably maybe linked back to me feeling like I'm not good enough and I have to achieve and all of this sort of stuff rolling into it. But by the by, it's I like to do a good job of things. I like to feel like I've given something my all, and I like to feel like I've done it properly, whatever that takes. That's a positive thing sometimes, but sometimes I end up, kind of going too far with it, really. But yeah, I think that's definitely something that's manifested in me.
I sometimes wonder I've always wondered with emotional resilience whether it's something that we're born with, or if it's something that we develop. Because I think it's really interesting that some people are incredibly emotionally resilient and some people are not. And I think people who've had lots of trauma, so myself as an example of that, kind of like almost like one thing after another. And then I sometimes think, I think my well's dry now. Like I really don't, like, don't want anything else major like that to happen. And yeah, and I don't know whether it is something that we just have, or that through trauma, it helps us to increase our emotional resilience, because you don't know how you're going to cope until you're put in the situation. So I think sometimes people say, oh gosh, that's terrible, and I don't know how I would have coped with that. Well, none of us do.
No.
Until it actually happens. And a lot of that then is probably linked to either, the people and the support around us at that time, perhaps when it happens in life. And I sometimes wonder whether children are actually much more emotionally resilient than adults, maybe. But yeah, I think there's obviously lots of factors, but I think it's an interesting topic to think about. Is it nature or nurture, really, in terms of emotional resilience?
If you're finding this conversation valuable and want more insights just like this, be sure to subscribe to our Educator newsletter. And it's where we share practical tools, interviews with sector leaders, and deep dives into the pressing issues facing and shaping education today. So it's completely free, and it's designed for educators like you who want to make that real impact. You can find the link to sign up in the show notes, or head over to cosmosltd.uk. And that's Cosmos, COSMOS Ltd.uk. And if you head over there, you can fill in the pop-up box for the newsletter. Don't miss out.
I think it's sort of multi-layered, and it depends on each different person and on the different circumstances as well. But when you were saying that, I was thinking that there's almost an element of it being a muscle that you flex, and it's kind of like you can build that muscle, and you can build that skill. And I suppose when you're exposed to trauma, you have no option other than to build that muscle, don't you? So I suppose the more you're exposed to it in some ways, the more you can sort of build it and build up that resilience. But I agree, it's different for everybody, and every different situation is unique. But I think there's something ironic as well in the fact that we've been talking about how the trauma that we've experienced has somehow made us feel like we're lacking in some way, or weak, or not strong. Yet at the same time, we're recognising that it's built resilience, and that we are massively resilient as a fact, as a result of the fact that we've come through all of that. And I think that conversation around superpowers for me is what I really want to do is for young people who might be experiencing trauma themselves, is to sort of say that, yeah, your life does change, and it does change forever, and it is awful, but you can still live an enriching life. And actually, it does give you some things as well. And some of those things are actually positive, or can be interpreted in a more positive light. I mean, I'm somebody that always wears rose-coloured glasses, but I think the superpowers that you develop as a result of those experiences, I think, is something positive that comes out of that.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's good to recognize some of those positive elements that come out of something that is so deep and traumatic as well, and how that can sometimes leave you better equipped to again deal with things that come your way in life. So I think, Gemma, like you were saying, like I don't think there would be many situations in life now that you wouldn't just be able to tackle or almost think that's fine. Whereas somebody else who hasn't necessarily obviously been through all of what you've been through might face the same things and think, oh my goodness, you know, like my world is falling apart essentially. So yeah, it's an interesting way to look at it. And it'd be great now to kind of have a think about, I suppose, how this plays out in the classroom, in schools. And I suppose firstly, why now? Why do we feel that this conversation needs to happen now?
I think coming back to the point that we made earlier about the level of trauma that we're seeing now with, you know, the pandemic's just exacerbated everything. I think also the cost of living crisis, I think, is causing trauma for a lot of people. So we talked about that link between poverty and trauma. And I think that sort of, you know, that's a really, really significant problem that we are facing now. And then I think the other reason why it's maybe pertinent to discuss it now is that I think there's more recognition of it now. I think it is definitely becoming much more recognised. And I think education has seen a bit of a shift and is starting to shift towards that more holistic approach to teaching, which is inclusive and which sort of, you know, celebrates difference and co-creates with the students. So, you know, this idea of relational pedagogy now, which is part of that more holistic approach that we have to higher education now, I think that really works when we're looking at it through that lens of trauma, because those approaches work really well when you're working with young people who have experienced trauma. They need somebody who can meet them wherever they're at and who will understand their specific circumstances and who will deal with them with empathy and with compassion. And we absolutely need that now more than ever, I think, because of the cost of living crisis and the impact of that. But also, I just think seeing what's happening in the world around us, and I think feeling that we're not living in a very stable world in society at the moment, are we? I think there are lots of threats out there, and that's, of course, also increased mental health, and loneliness is also on the increase as well. So connection is really important for that. Connection is really important for coping and dealing with trauma as well. So there's lots of things that I think are all interlinked here.
Yeah, I think you summarised that really well, Helen, just in terms of where we are now and those macro kind of influences and, yeah, the impact of COVID. And, you know, we're still feeling it now, aren't we, really? Not just in the schools, but all the way through kind of the educational journey generally. You know, when we speak to students, in terms of the research that we do, it's still there. They're still referencing it, and something that's been a point in time that where they felt that they've lost something during that period and not necessarily been able to get that back, whether it is connection and talking and to students. And I think we've seen that students have missed out on that connection, but then also when they're coming back into the classroom, it's difficult for them to be able to connect in that way and actually have that conversation.
I think also that, I know more recently now with social media and some of the impacts, trauma can be happening behind, you know, a child in a, you know, we watched the series Adolescence, you know, it could be happening on a phone, you know, in a private space and not being aware of it. So I think educators, whether it be, you know, in schools, colleges or higher education institutions, just being more aware of the impact of traumatic experience on a person's well-being and educational attainment and their part of their student journey is just really important. More, like I say, more so forever than ever, than all those reasons that Helen's just said.
And I think as well, in terms of how it might show up and play out in like a school college setting, might be different to, you know, students at university, I suppose. There's the journey that we need to think about as well, because as we've established, this is something that just follows you through life. And it might be something that you feel that you've put in a box and dealt with when you were younger, but actually is having that impact. So I suppose, I don't know if there's things that you've maybe noticed or seen that you might suggest that students are dealing with something beyond, what's actually happening in that educational setting. I don't know if you feel you've seen any examples of that, in terms of student behaviours or anything like that.
I think we see that students are more and more not just students. They're often parents, they're often employees, they're often carers. They often are dealing with their own maybe mental health issues or their own emotional resilience. And I think that awareness of the more holistic approach to, not just producing results in terms of educational outcomes, it's also looking at the bigger picture of the adults of the future, really, in terms of their wider skills, and whether that's employability skills or their own self-efficacy, those metacognitive skills. And I think a lot of that has been impacted through COVID, particularly, as you were saying, Helen, around that cohesiveness and collaboration. So a lot of things that happen on teams and not in the classroom, and those interaction skills still need quite a lot of work. And I think we still hear that from schools in terms of specific cohorts. There was something recently that I think there was an article in TES about actually the current year 6 going into year 7. Another group that were significantly impacted by COVID, and there will be things that high schools will need to do to identify what they missed during their COVID years. And so, the knock-on effect of that isn't just educational. It's obviously about those softer skills and those skills for employability. So I think the more we can embed the concepts around trauma-informed practice into pedagogy, as Helen was saying, all aspects of the educational journey, I think that would have the most impact.
And I suppose if it's an educator who's come into this for the first time, it can feel like quite a big, scary topic. It's a big thing, trauma, and it's a sensitive thing. So yeah, I suppose the question in that is almost, how do we need to think about this? What are the things that we need to think about doing as educators, as practitioners? What are those things, do we think?
I think CPD for teachers and educators is always really key to sort of understanding that and giving them the skills and the knowledge that they need to be able to apply that. I'm also the chair of a community of practice, which is focusing on boys and on the attainment gap for free school meal boys. And we had somebody present last week from a school in Rochdale, and they've managed to close the attainment gap at their school. And the way that they've done that is by taking a more compassionate and relational approach. And that's not just to learning, that's to the whole school culture. So for them, it's been an entire culture shift for the school that is focused on love, care, relational learning. So building those relationships with the young people and really understanding where they're coming from, what they're dealing with. And it's worked.
Wow.
So the answers, I think the answers are there. And I think it is very much rooted in this much more holistic approach, but it does need to be driven by leaders, and it needs to be underpinned and supported by training and by resources, as well as sort of policy and strategy.
So are there any kind of specific, I suppose, examples of things that they might have done? That sounds quite maybe like a revolutionary way to look at things, really, just in terms of, like you say, compassion and empathy and a whole cultural shift. Like how does that look in practice, I suppose? Can you give any examples?
Well, we can invite him to come on a future podcast. I'm sure he would.
That'd be great.
It's really interesting. I think one of the things they did was did a survey with the school to look at the perceptions. In this case, it was the perceptions of their learners from the perspective of whether they were male or whether they were female. And, they noticed some real anomalies within that. And they were sort of saying, we expect boys and girls to achieve the same. We have the same expectations on them. Yet when he looked at the data around sort of attitudes and behaviours, there was a very different picture that was being shown. And actually, boys were being rewarded for not behaving badly, and the girls were sort of being ignored. So they then had something to come back to the school to say, well, actually, you've said this in the survey, but in practice, this isn't what's happening. So, and things like peer mentoring programs as well are really, really powerful within schools, whether they're delivered externally by staff within the school. Sometimes it can be older age groups mentoring younger students. There's been a lot of successes, I know, in schools with mentoring.
Have you seen any good examples of this practice, empathy and as trauma-informed practice as well?
I think it's about knowing your students, however old they are, really. I think we see it in other areas of work. So, for example, young people tend to do better in school sixth forms in terms of progression into higher education than in FE. And one of the main reasons for that has to be around that transition. And it's a whole new group of people that don't know you, whereas schools still hold that knowledge. So whether it's pupil premium markers, whether it's military children, whether it's looked after, although colleges may pick up on some of that information, if there is a history of the school knowing that child, I think that's a helpful starting point. And I think that carries on then even through higher education. So looking at the student journey, it's really important that lecturers know who's in the classroom, what needs have they got, what help and support do they need, and then to take that to the next level of what trauma they may be facing, have faced, what personal circumstances they may have. And I have to think back to that lecturer I had at university. If he hadn't have taken the time to come and seek me out and he noticed that I wasn't there. And I sort of wonder, would that happen now? And I think in places where there's good student progression and continuation and success, I bet it would. And I bet they do know the students. And I think that's really important that somebody's asking those questions, because I think often my experience was that I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to tell anybody what was happening, and I just wanted to fit in. So I wasn't going to be seeking out help. And I think we mustn't assume that young people will seek help for things. Actually, they might actually be trying to hide what's happening at home, and it's really important that safeguarding teams are as aware as possible of what might be happening and helping and supporting as best they can.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about students not necessarily wanting to broadcast it, because we've all talked about the fact we wanted to, it's not something you want to highlight really, is it? You want to fit in, you want to feel like you kind of belong in a way.
Yeah, but you also need, I think, sometimes to know that the right people know and are aware, so that they can provide the right support without you having to articulate it yourself, because it's very painful to have to do that. But I think exactly what Gemma's just said is that these approaches, relational approaches to teaching and learning, these more holistic approaches, and also the concept of connection as well. It's all about getting to know the young people, isn't it? And I think you're absolutely right that that's lost when they then move on to college. And I think that's probably what happened to me when I moved on to college and eventually dropped out and left home and came back to HE a few years later.
Yeah, and I want to build on that, the topic of like love in the classroom, because you brought that up earlier this morning in your presentation, and I just love that idea. So the sense of empathy, love, knowing your students, having that sense of belonging, and you highlighted that there's emerging evidence around that and how important that is when it comes to trauma-informed practice. So I suppose it's kind of how you've seen in the evidence and things that you've been looking at, how you see this play out in terms of, overcoming those barriers for students.
Mm-hmm. I think it was the quote from Bell Hooks, wasn't it?
It was,
yeah. That I had. I can read it out.
Actually.
When teachers teach with love, combining care, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, respect and trust, we often are often able to enter the classroom and go straight to the heart of the matter, which is knowing what to do on any given day to create the best climate for learning. So essentially, I think that's what it is all about. It's creating the best possible environment that there is, is to enable all learners to be able to learn. She talks about the power of education, which is what I really, really, really like, and I think which really sort of resonates with us, and that it empowers students as well, because it empowers them to think critically and to develop self-efficacy skills and autonomy, and also there's the social justice that sits behind it as well, and sort of like challenging oppression. So I think she's not coming from it from a sentimental point of view when she talks about love in the classroom, although for me I'm really, really sentimental, so that's definitely there for me, but it's it's sort of more intentional and rooted in justice, but it's about care and commitment and having courage, and I think, it's being the best that you can be. Everybody wants to be the best teacher that they can be and to do the best for their learners, don't they? But I think when saying all of this, I do think we need to be mindful of the environment that educators are operating within as well, because I know they are operating within a lot of stress and financial constraints. So I do understand those challenges that they're facing. And I think what we should be doing is supporting them as much as possible to have the space and the resource to create these kinds of learning environments that support all students, but particularly those who have experienced trauma, and which is going to be probably at least 60% of your classroom.
Yeah, it's a lot. And I suppose for us as well, working in the access and participation space, we're working directly with those students. So, I imagine the percentage is going to be quite a lot higher given the the target cohorts that we're working with. And I suppose it's just an exploration of what we can do in our capacity in terms of delivering the programs and how we approach the students. How can we approach that and support that element for those students?
I think we try and build a sense of belonging in the students. So in terms of the evaluation of activities that we deliver, what we're looking at for the impact of those activities is kind of like using pre and post surveys, for example, to just try and sense check how much a student feels that they do belong in higher education, and the impact actually we find of bringing young people onto a university campus, actually getting to feel that this could be somewhere that I could see myself. And we know that sort of seeing is believing. So actually seeing people that look like you in that campus, actually seeing people that perhaps knowing that there's students that went from your school, like alumni from your school that perhaps are now students there. So we use a lot of student ambassadors. We try and link student ambassadors as well to the schools that they went to locally, if that's relevant and possible, because actually seeing people that came to your school and have walked in your shoes, that have progressed onto HE and are being successful and doing well, helps young people to envisage that that's something that I could belong there and I could do that. And I think it's interesting that poverty is such a key influence of trauma, really, because obviously we see that free school meal pupils, one of the markers that we have for poverty in the home, that gap in terms of their progression to higher education is still there, and it's not closing. Again, going back to why do we need to look at this, I think we do need to do more, really, in terms of how we support those students to really feel that HE is for them. We're not saying it's everybody's option, but we do know that higher education is one of the key things to improve social mobility. So it is important that we do look at that, and that can be obviously through degree apprenticeships and other pathways, but certainly education is yours to own, isn't it? And nobody can take that away from you once you have that, and it's yours forever. And the more we can do, I think, to get young people to look at all the pathways and make those informed decisions, really, about their future, is key.
I love that. And I love that quote, education is yours to own forever. Yeah. I like that.
Very
And the sense of belonging is just, it's critical, it's crucial, and just how intrinsic it is and critical in students to feel like they belong somewhere. It just impacts everything, just in terms of their motivation, their aspiration, what they feel they can do or go on to achieve. And we know that, again, there's been a lot of kind of academic research around this as well. So I know, so Jacqueline Stevenson, possible cells, if they don't believe that, then it's not going to happen. They won't put the steps in place to be able to achieve that. And I know that, Helen, again, this was something that you were talking about earlier as well. And that almost being like the key to unlocking everything is them feeling like they belong somewhere. And again, Gemma, like you were saying, seeing somebody that looks like them or even has had the same experience as them in the same place. And for me, because I was thinking back on this and I was reflecting, and what was interesting was that when I was younger, I really wanted to be a journalist. Fast forward now, hosting this podcast, but my inner child there. But yeah, I desperately wanted to be a journalist. And I was kind of going through my choices and things like that. And I think I came to that critical point of, choosing your options and the subjects you wanted to do. And I did a bit of research and looked it up, and I couldn't see anybody that was Black, essentially, that were, any prominent journalist figures that were Black. And in my mind, I just scratched that out as an option. I was just like, well, I can't do that because there are no Black journalists. I mean, there might have been at the time, this is a long time ago now, but I couldn't see any, and I just completely discounted that and just thought, well, I can't do it. I won't be able to do it because there's nobody there and I suppose from a logical perspective, it's actually it's a logical thing to think, but yeah, that could have changed my kind of life trajectory, really.
There's a lot of work being done with primary schools around stereotypes in careers. So when you actually ask children to draw pictures of what does a doctor look like or what does a police officer look like, it's very predictable in terms of what they come up with. And that you got to see it to be it is proven, isn't it, now in research? And there's a lot more to do, I think, on that area. Teaching is a prime example. The percentage of Black male teachers in this country is, I think, about 4%. It might even be less. But yeah, it's absolutely tiny, and it's really important that we address that and we do something about that, because that's been the case for far too long now.
I mean, I was thinking the same thing. It's that you can't be what you can't see. And so I think, we do have a responsibility when we're bringing young people onto campus to make sure that we provide peers for them that are relatable and that they can look up to. So I do think using student ambassadors is really powerful in that. But it goes a lot deeper than that. And I know there's a lot of work going on in universities around sort of more inclusive curriculums is an example of that. And, that sort of helps to sort of generate that sense of belonging, actually, because if you can see yourself in the curriculum as well, then you're more likely to be more engaged. And actually, the greater the sense of belonging, the more likely you are to engage in your studies. The more you engage in your studies and the extracurricular things, the more likely you are to be a successful student. So belonging really is absolutely really fundamental, I think, to all of that.
Yeah, so much to kind of explore. It feels like almost like a start point, doesn't it, in a way? And I suppose the kind of the context for this conversation is that I suppose we don't want to come on here and say, oh, we've got all the answers. It was more just to kind of start that conversation and highlight the fact that this is an important topic, and particularly in the area and the work that we're doing, and it's something that we need to pay attention to, and particularly so now, as we've talked about, given the situation that we're in kind of environmentally as well, and the impact that that's having on students.
I think the other thing I was going to add there as well was something around safe spaces. So I think, again, that's really important, having safe spaces. I mean, that could be within the classroom and feeling safe to engage and to bring your whole self to the classroom. But also it might be sort of safe spaces on campuses that are specifically for certain groups. So it might be dedicated cultural or LGBTQ plus groups. In terms of outreach, we do tailored outreach activities as well. I think most UniConnect partnerships and universities have a tailored offer for care experience students. So obviously care experienced students will all have some kind of trauma. It will all be different and unique, but we have tailored programmes for those. We're running a day this summer for young carers. We also offer a campus visit specifically for neurodivergent young people as well. So I think that, there's quite a lot out there, isn't there, that's being offered and being done in that space.
Thank you for that. So yeah, I suppose kind of then just reflecting on everything we spoke about and the fact that we said, this is just a kind of start point, really. We want to open the conversation and highlight this. What advice would we kind of want to give to educators that are just starting to look at this, or access and WP managers, practitioners? Where do we think we should start in terms of trauma-informed practice and, we really looking at trying to deepen their knowledge on this topic?
What educators do you mean? I think it depends whether we're looking at
that's true.
high school or college or education. I think there's differences depending on the setting and the level of study.
Yeah, that's true. It's a good point. So, I mean, I suppose school, really, the one educators that are in school, that's a key one, isn't it? Really. I suppose it's thinking what they kind of need to do as a next step in that sense.
I think the point Helen made earlier about CPD is important. So I think looking at one thing we said we might do alongside this was a bit of a literature review, didn't we? Of where some of this, some of the reading that we've been finding interesting and looking at, maybe sort of collating that in one place, a starting point. And I think in the sort of lead up to us doing this podcast, we talked a little bit about some sort of toolkit, didn't we? Some sort of resource that we might be able to. It's just a thought bubble, isn't it, at the moment?
It is,
but, that we could potentially collate something as a resource.
I think so, yes. And I think it's drawing on best practice as well. So I'm thinking if we know somebody who's done something in a school and it's worked, it's like, right, well, let's learn from that. Let's look at the research, but let's look at the practices as well. And so I think we can definitely do that and try to piece something together. But I think, like I said, it's about, I think what you're trying to achieve is a culture shift. I think that's the kind of the end goal, really, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose picking up on Gemma's point, we did have that conversation around developing some sort of resources guide, looking at how we can interact with students that may have been exposed to trauma. So signposting to, this depth of research that we've kind of come across in the lead up. I think that'll be a good starting point. And having a look at what we can produce off the back of this. So people stay tuned. We will have something to offer off the back of this for practitioners in education.
Yeah, and any experts out there that want to contribute, please feel free to get in touch. I don't think we're the experts. We're just happy to talk about it, to talk about our own experience and how it applies to our own practice. And we're always open to learning new things as well, aren't we?
Definitely. Okay, well, I think that concludes our episode today. So I just want to give a very big thank you to Gemma and Helen for, contributing their time, not only their time, but also their experiences, their personal experiences. So, a heartfelt thank you very much for opening up. And I think watch this space in terms of next steps.